For 6 years, a SERE instructor ran training by the book, except for 3 students each cycle who vanished into the Washington wilderness and came back different. When the Air Force finally investigated, they discovered a training program that officially didn't exist. Before we reveal what those students learned in the darkness, don't forget to subscribe. And tell us which country and city you're watching from. The notification came through at 02:17 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning in October. Major Rebecca Klein sat in her quarters at Fairchild Air Force Base, staring at the message on her secure tablet. 3 names. 3 SERE students who'd gone off-grid during survival training. Standard protocol required a 24-hour window before initiating search procedures, but something about the timing felt wrong. She pulled up the training roster and cross-referenced the instructor assignments. The same name appeared across 6 years of records. Master Sergeant Owen Vance. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. The man had a spotless record. 100% graduation rate. 0 incidents. Commendations from every commanding officer who'd overseen his training cycles. But as Klein scrolled through the digital files at 02:33 a.m., she noticed something the automated systems had missed. 3 students per cycle. Every single time. Gone for exactly 72 hours. No distress signals. No GPS pings. No emergency activations. Then they reappeared at the rally point as if nothing had happened. Klein pulled 6 years of data. 312 students graduated through Vance's program. She filtered for the anomalies. 18 total disappearances across 12 training cycles. The pattern was too precise to be coincidental. Each group of 3 vanished during week 4 of the 6-week course, always between 04 am and 06 am, always from different grid coordinates in the training area. The GPS transponders each student wore showed signal degradation over a 15-minute period, then complete loss. Standard equipment failure protocols required immediate emergency beacon activation, and none of the 18 students had ever triggered that failsafe. When they reappeared, 72 hours later, their transponders came back online simultaneously, showing 0 malfunction codes in the diagnostic logs. The devices hadn't failed. They'd been deliberately deactivated. In Mod 2:51 a.m., Klein ran a secondary analysis, student performance metrics before and after the disappearances. What she found made her reach for the encrypted phone. Every single student who'd gone through Vance's 72-hour program showed dramatic improvement in evasion scores, survival aptitude, and resistance to interrogation techniques. Their post-training evaluations weren't just better, they were off the charts. She made 2 calls before sunrise. The first went to the base security chief. The second went to Air Force Office of Special Investigations. By 06:45 a.m., a team was assembling in the restricted briefing room on the north side of the base. Klein arrived with 6 months of compiled data, training logs, GPS tracks, satellite imagery, even weather patterns. The SERE School operated in the dense forests east of Fairchild. 40,000 acres of Pacific Northwest wilderness that had trained aviators in survival skills since 1966. Students learned to evade capture, resist interrogation, and survive in hostile environments with minimal equipment. It was brutal, methodical, and by regulation, completely trackable. Every student wore a transponder. Every movement logged. Every communication monitored. Except for these 3 students per cycle, who somehow slipped through every layer of surveillance for 3 full days. The lead investigator was a sharp-eyed captain named Morris who'd spent 8 years in counterintelligence. He studied Klein's presentation in silence, his jaw tightening as the pattern became undeniable. At 08:20 a.m., he made the call to pull Master Sergeant Vance from the current training cycle for immediate questioning. But when the security team arrived at the SERE compound at 9:05 a.m., Vance wasn't there. His vehicle sat in the parking lot. His gear locker was secured. The duty officer reported he'd signed out at 05:30 a.m. for a routine patrol check. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual, except Master Sergeant Owen Vance hadn't returned. And according to the base perimeter logs, he'd never checked back through any of the gates. Morris ordered a full lockdown of the training area at 09:47 a.m. Search teams deployed into the forest with thermal imaging, K9 units, and aerial drone support. The current SERE class, 22 students in week 3 of the 6-week program, were gathered at the central compound and placed under supervised restriction. Klein interviewed each of them separately throughout the morning, watching for micro-expressions, inconsistencies, anything that might reveal knowledge they weren't sharing. None had seen Vance since the previous evening's debriefing at 8:30 p.m. None reported anything unusual. The interviews followed standard protocol: baseline questions, timeline reconstruction, relationship assessment. 18 students showed expected patterns of concern and confusion. But 3 students, 2 men and 1 woman, sat with a particular stillness during questioning. They answered every question correctly, maintained eye contact, showed no signs of deception. Their heart rates remained steady on the biometric monitors. Their stress indicators were normal, yet something in their posture suggested they were waiting. Not nervous, not afraid. Just waiting. Klein made a note of their names and flagged them for secondary interviews once Vance was located. By 02:15 p.m., the search grid had covered 8 square miles with no trace of Vance. Morris stood in the operations center, studying the topographic maps spread across the tables. Klein joined him, her arms crossed against the afternoon chill that seeped through the building's thin walls. She pointed to a series of markings she'd made on the satellite imagery. Areas where previous GPS signals had gone dark before students reappeared. The zones formed a rough triangle, each point approximately 12 miles from the SERE compound. No roads, no trails, no infrastructure of any kind. Just dense forest, steep ravines, and terrain that made conventional tracking nearly impossible. The search teams had deployed every available resource. Thermal imaging drones swept the canopy at altitudes from 500 to 2,000 feet. K9 units worked scent trails that led nowhere. Ground-penetrating radar scanned for underground structures. Signal intelligence equipment listened for any electronic emissions. The operation was consuming resources at a rate that would require justification to the base commander by 06:00 p.m., and Morris knew it. He authorized one more sweep. High-resolution synthetic aperture radar imaging that could penetrate forest cover and map terrain features invisible to optical sensors. The request was flagged and routed through 3 levels of clearance before being approved at 4:33 p.m. The answer came back 2 hours later. No anomalies detected. No structures. No heat signatures. Nothing but trees and rock and the endless green of the wilderness. Yet Klein couldn't shake the feeling they were missing something obvious. She pulled up the historical satellite imagery again, this time looking at seasonal variations. Winter images with snow cover. Spring flooding patterns. Summer canopy density. Fall when the leaves dropped. And there, barely visible in a single frame from February 2022, a thermal anomaly that lasted exactly 4 hours before vanishing. It appeared in the northeast quadrant, 11.3 miles from the compound, in terrain so steep most of the search teams had bypassed it as impassable. At 7:20 p.m., as the sun dropped below the ridgeline and the temperature fell to 38 degrees, one of the K9 units hit a scent trail 3 miles northeast of the compound. The handler radioed in the find, a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch at the edge of a steep embankment. The fabric matched Vance's standard issue jacket. The search teams converged on the location by 08:05 p.m., their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as they descended into the ravine. What they found at the bottom made the team leader immediately call for Morris and Klein. A small clearing. A carefully arranged pile of stones, and a set of markings carved into the bark of a massive Douglas. For coordinates in a format none of them recognized, Morris had the coordinates. Analyzed by 10:40 p.m., they didn't match any standard. A military or civilian navigation system, but when a specialist from the cryptologic division ran them through historical databases, a match appeared. World War II-era escape and evasion codes used by downed pilots in occupied Europe. The system had been obsolete for 80 years, replaced by modern GPS and digital navigation. Yet here it was, carved into a tree in the middle of a Washington forest by an instructor who'd somehow learned a dead language of survival. The coordinates pointed to a location 14 miles northwest, deep, in the restricted training zone where even authorized personnel rarely ventured, Klein assembled a tactical team by 11:55 p.m. 6 operators, full night vision capability, and explicit orders to observe only unless Vance or the missing students were in immediate danger. They moved out at 12:20 a.m. under a moonless sky, the forest pressing in around them like a living thing. The terrain was punishing, vertical climbs, water crossings, deadfall that forced constant route adjustments. By 03:15 a.m., they'd covered 9 miles and were closing on the coordinates. That's when the point man raised his fist, signaling contact. The team went to ground, weapons ready, scanning the darkness ahead. Through the night vision, they could see a structure that shouldn't exist. Not a building, something older. A dugout carved into the hillside, camouflaged so thoroughly that even from 50 yards it was nearly invisible. A thin wisp of smoke rose from a concealed vent. And in the clearing in front of the entrance, 3 figures sat in the dirt, their hands working at something the team couldn't quite make out from their position. Morris gave the signal to hold. They waited. In 04:02 a.m., a 4th figure emerged from the dugout. A Master Sergeant Owen Vance. He moved between the 3 students, checking their work, occasionally kneeling to demonstrate something with his hands. No words were spoken. Just gesture, observation, and the careful instruction of skills being passed from teacher to student in absolute silence. Klein watched through binoculars as the scene unfolded. The students weren't building shelters or setting traps, the standard SERE curriculum she knew by heart. They were doing something else entirely. Their movements were deliberate, methodical, and focused on the ground itself. It took her several minutes to understand. They were creating false trails, manipulating the forest floor to suggest movement in directions they hadn't traveled, bending branches to create misleading wind patterns, using natural materials to mask thermal signatures. One student was working with moss and lichen, transplanting sections to cover freshly disturbed soil. Another was adjusting the spacing of footprints to suggest a different gait and weight distribution. The third was using a branch to sweep areas clean, then carefully replacing organic matter in patterns that looked natural but would confuse tracking dogs. These weren't survival skills. These were ghost protocols, techniques for disappearing so completely that even advanced surveillance technology couldn't track them. Vance moved between them with the precision of a master craftsman, occasionally adjusting their work with minimal gestures. No words, no explanations, just demonstration and correction through pure observation. At 05:47 a.m., as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Vance stood and made a sharp gesture. The 3 students immediately stopped their work, gathered their minimal gear, and formed up in a loose column. Vance led them out of the clearing, moving northeast at a pace that seemed impossibly fast for the terrain. Morris made a split-second decision. He divided his team. 3 to follow Vance and the students, 3 to investigate the dugout. Klein went with the investigation team. What they found inside made her understand why this program had remained hidden for 6 years. The dugout was a masterpiece of field engineering. 12 feet deep, reinforced with timber and stone, ventilated through a system of concealed pipes that dispersed smoke across a quarter-mile radius. Inside were teaching materials that belonged in a museum or a classified archive. Maps using pre-GPS navigation systems, celestial navigation charts, terrain association guides, dead reckoning tables, communication protocols from Cold War era escape networks, burst transmission codes, one-time pad cipher systems, nonverbal signal methods using natural materials, evasion techniques developed for operations in denied territory where modern technology couldn't be relied upon, how to defeat thermal imaging using temperature differentials in terrain, how to mask electromagnetic signatures, how to create false movement patterns that fooled motion sensors. The walls were lined with reference materials. Survival manuals from 6 different decades, each one annotated in Vance's handwriting with updates and modifications. There were sections on defeating facial recognition systems, evading biometric scanners, and moving through areas saturated with surveillance drones. This wasn't just survival training. This was a comprehensive course in becoming invisible in the 21st century. And a handwritten manual hundreds of pages long, documenting methods for surviving in an environment where the enemy had total surveillance dominance. The signature on the first page was Owen Vance's, but the date was from 1998, when he would have been 19 years old, barely out of basic training. Klein photographed every page with her secure camera, her hands steady despite the implications of what she was documenting. The manual's opening section outlined a philosophy that contradicted every modern doctrine. Technology was the enemy's advantage, and the only counter was to abandon it entirely. No GPS, no radios, no electronic devices of any kind. Return to skills that predated satellites and surveillance networks. Skills that had kept soldiers alive for centuries before the digital age. The manual referenced operations Klein had never heard of, training programs that didn't appear in any official records, and methods developed by operators whose names were redacted even in this hidden document. Morris's team tracked Vance and the students for 6 hours before losing them at a river crossing at 11:52 a.m. The trail simply vanished. No tracks on either bank. No disturbed vegetation. No thermal signatures picked up by the drone orbiting overhead at 2,000 feet. It was as if 4 human beings had evaporated into the landscape itself. The search continued through the afternoon, expanding the grid and deploying additional resources. But by 06:30 p.m., even Morris had to admit they'd been outmaneuvered by a 44-year-old survival instructor and 3 students who'd been in training for less than 3. The weeks, Vance and the students walked back into the SERE compound at 8:12 p.m., exactly 72 hours after they'd disappeared. They were clean, hydrated, and showed no signs of exhaustion. The 3 students rejoined their classmates without comment. Vance reported to Morris's temporary command post, stood at attention, and waited. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Morris finally spoke. 2 words. Explain it. Vance's response was measured and direct. He'd been running an advanced module for selected students since 2018, training them for a operational reality the official curriculum hadn't caught up to yet. Modern warfare had become a surveillance state. Drones, satellites, signals intelligence, biometric tracking. An evader couldn't just hide from human searchers anymore. They had to hide from machines. From algorithms. From technology that never slept and never stopped watching. The skills he was teaching weren't in any manual because they'd been developed in the field, by operators who'd survived in places where being found meant death. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. Air Force OSI interviewed every student who'd gone through Vance's advanced module, 47 names spanning 6 years. The pattern was undeniable. Every single one had gone on to high-risk assignments in contested airspace, denied territory, and special reconnaissance missions. Their survival rates were unprecedented. 0 casualties, 0 compromises, 0 failures. One pararescueman had survived 19 days behind enemy lines in Syria. Another had extracted a wounded pilot from territory so heavily surveilled that command had written the mission off as unrecoverable. The numbers told the story Vance couldn't. Whatever he was teaching in those 72-hour disappearances was keeping Air Force personnel alive in the most dangerous environments on Earth. The inquiry board convened at 9:00 a.m. on November 18th in a classified briefing room at Joint Base Lewis McChord. 3 colonels, 2 lieutenant colonels, and a brigadier general from Air Force Special Operations Command. Vance sat alone at the witness table, his service record projected behind him. The board members had reviewed every piece of evidence, video testimony from students, mission reports showing impossible survival statistics, the manual from the dugout, and classified files from 1998. The general leaned forward at 09:47 a.m., his voice measured. "Where did you learn this?" Vance had maintained complete composure for 3 weeks, but this question reached deeper. "From the man who pulled me out of Kandahar when I was 19 and everyone else thought I was dead." The general pulled an old folder from his stack. Colonel James Mackenzie, call sign Phantom, CIA Special Activities Division, retired 2003, deceased 2011. Mackenzie had been a legend in circles that didn't officially exist, developing methods for evading sophisticated surveillance across 3 decades. In 1998, he'd found a 19-year-old airman who'd survived 23 days in enemy territory using instincts that couldn't be taught through standard training. He'd taken Vance off the radar for 6 months, teaching him techniques the military had abandoned. Then he'd sent him back with instructions to never speak about it unless someone needed it to survive. The board deliberated for 4 hours. Their decision came down at 04:35 p.m. Master Sergeant Owen Vance would not face court-martial. His unauthorized training program would not be shut down. Instead, it would be officially recognized, properly resourced, and expanded. The Air Force had spent billions developing technology to track enemy combatants: satellite networks, drone surveillance, signals intelligence, biometric databases. But Vance had spent 6 years teaching their own people how to defeat that same technology, because he understood that in the next war, American forces might be the ones being hunted. The strategic implications were undeniable. Peer adversaries now possessed surveillance capabilities that rivaled or exceeded U.S. systems. China's integrated air defense networks, Russia's signals intelligence apparatus, emerging technologies that made the battlefield transparent in ways previous generations of warriors never faced. The module would be designated Advanced Evasion Protocols, classified at the TS-SCI level, and offered to selected students who demonstrated exceptional aptitude during standard SERE training. Selection criteria would be rigorous: psychological resilience, demonstrated survival instinct, and an ability to think asymmetrically about modern threats. Vance would design the curriculum, train a cadre of instructors hand-picked from special operations backgrounds, and continue his work in the Washington wilderness, where surveillance systems went blind and humans learned to be ghosts. The program would receive dedicated funding, secure facilities, and integration into the larger special operations training pipeline. Students who completed the 72-hour module would be tracked for career development and preferentially assigned to in high-risk missions where their unique capabilities could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The first official budget allocation was approved by 08:00 p.m. that evening, $3.2 million for infrastructure, equipment, and personnel. By modern military standards, it was a rounding error. But for Vance, it meant he could finally bring Mackenzie's legacy out of the shadows and give it the institutional support it deserved. The approval came with conditions, of course: regular oversight, standardized evaluation metrics, integration with existing training frameworks. But the board understood that the program's effectiveness came from its unorthodox nature, from teaching methods that contradicted modern doctrine and embraced techniques the military had abandoned 30 years ago. The balance would be delicate, but the results spoke for themselves. At 07:20 p.m. that evening, Klein found Vance outside the SERE compound, watching the last light fade. She stood beside him, the temperature dropping to 34 degrees. She'd read the Kandahar report, how a 19-year-old had survived 23 days in Taliban territory, walking 140 miles to safety with techniques that shouldn't have been possible for standard training. The report described impossible navigation, survival on minimal resources, and crossing 3 Taliban strongholds undetected. Vance was quiet for a long moment. "Mackenzie found me on day 21. I had 2 days of water left." He was running a classified op in the area, saw my survival pattern, and recognized it wasn't luck. He extracted me, spent 2 days teaching me what I needed to know, then sent me toward friendly forces with instructions to never mention he'd been there. The official record showed Vance walking in alone. The truth was a crash course from one of CIA's most skilled operators, kept secret because the program didn't officially exist. "They're looking for us everywhere now," Vance said, eyes on the horizon. "Satellites, drones, intelligence networks. Our people need to know how to disappear, because in the next conflict, it might be Americans doing the evading." The first official class of Advanced Evasion Protocols began 3 months later at 05:30 a.m. on a February morning when frost covered the ground. 12 students, 72 hours in the wilderness. A training program that would remain classified for 20 years, not because it was dangerous, but because it worked too well. The selection process identified candidates from across Air Force Special Operations who'd demonstrated exceptional performance and psychological resilience. Vance met them at the tree line as dawn broke at 6:15 a.m. No introductions. No speeches. For the next 3 days, You will learn to be invisible. Not hidden, invisible. When we're done, you'll be able to move through the most sophisticated surveillance network on Earth and leave no trace. The training incorporated everything Mackenzie had taught 26 years earlier. Updated for modern threats, students learned to defeat thermal imaging, navigate without electronics, eliminate every signal their bodies generated, and master patience, moving at speeds measured in feet per hour when necessary. By May, all 12 graduated. Within a year, the program's effectiveness was undeniable. Operators were completing missions in denied territory previously assessed as impossible, evading capture where detection should have been certain. The 3 students from that October cycle went on to prove everything Vance had taught. Senior Airman Marcus Chen became a combat controller in Syria, directing strikes from positions so deep in enemy territory his presence remained unconfirmed for 8 months. Technical Sergeant SERE Okonkwo joined Arctic Search and Rescue, mastering extreme survival without electronics. Staff Sergeant James Whitmore became an instructor, adapting techniques for urban environments and facial recognition systems. By 2029, Advanced Evasion Protocols had trained over 200 operators with a 95% mission success rate in environments where standard doctrine predicted 60% failure. The program remained classified, its graduates identified only by a notation in their records. And in the forests east of Fairchild Air Force Base, Master Sergeant Owen Vance continued his work where surveillance ended and survival began. Training warriors to disappear and emerge only when they chose, carrying forward a legacy from a CIA operator who'd refused to let a 19-year-old die in Afghan mountains. Teaching skills that would keep American forces alive in wars yet to come.